podcast you're about to listen to is from a book series on post-qualitative, new materialist and critical post-humanist research. I'm Karen Murris and chief editor of this new Routledge series. You can find it on the following website, www.postqualitativeresearch.com.
Hi, my name is Nicole and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Early Childhood Studies at Toronto Metropolitan University. And I'm the author of the book Bodying Postqualitative Research on being a researching body in the Fissures of Humanism. And I'm excited to share with you today some thoughts through this podcast about the book and about how I hope that readers might engage the book. So my intentions for this podcast are to situate the propositions that I'm offering in the book as something in intimate dialogue with pedagogy and draw us into questions of world-making with post-qualitative research, reminding us of what we already feel in our bones and those tiny colliding bones that live in our ears and that are vibrating as we take in this digital one-sided conversation. We know that pedagogy and post-qualitative research are never abstract or disembodied. Even when we meet them in really habitual modes like black typeface on a white computer screen in a PDF, these practices are bodying. Notice, for example, your body right now. What is your skin contacting? How are your tailbones anchoring you to the earth? Which muscles are still and which muscles are busy? And which muscles have you learned to notice, and what muscular work have you accepted as imperceptible? How your body is unfurling or coming to matter, which is the work that I call bodying in the book, is a filament of a researching process. To encounter questions of, say, subjectivity while shivering and covered in goosebumps is different than how a body might be hospitable to or interrogate subjectivity's contours when it's pouring sweat and you're wiping sunscreen from your burning eyes. And because of these differences, because of bodying and the differences bodying makes possible, we really need to be concerned with how bodies do post-qualitative researching practices. This is the central question that I pivot in the book. The book is purposefully short. It's not an encyclopedia that surveys all the possibilities for bodying post-qualitative research. Instead, I'm thinking of it as an agitation, as an offering that incites. And it's really my hope that readers will engage the book as such, recognizing its incompleteness also as its ethic. So there are two big intentions that ground the book, Bodying Postqualitative Research. The first is I really intend to start to dismantle the inherited humanist epistemologies that typically govern how we come to know the body with researching. And then the second intention flows from that. It's to speculate how we might body post-qualitative work through generating unfamiliar relations with the biosciences, and most specifically with feminist science studies scholars. This move, I think, is essential because the biosciences hold vast interpretive power in how research often makes a body perceptible. But at the same time, the relations that we choose to sustain and refuse with the biological sciences canon are a question of ethics and politics and of pedagogy. So we'll talk quickly about both intentions for the book. So this first intention, to research in the fissures of humanism. I use fissures intentionally as language, as lexicon, to mark a crack, but not a severing or a disappearance. Humanism hasn't become eradicated in the wake of post-qualitative proposals. Therefore, when I think post-qualitative problems, good problems like data, methodology, and clarity in the fissures of humanism, I'm seeking small breaks, fleeting moments where bodying data and methodology and clarity might become otherwise possible. And when I use otherwise in this context, I'm meaning something markedly different from humanism's ontological pillars like representation, universalism, truth, and individualism. In the book, I take up this intention through thinking alongside caffeine shakes, antipsychotic medications, and scar formation, but there's a whole universe of bodied encounters that complexify how data, methodology, and clarity might be enacted outside of humanist logics. What I work hard to propose in each of these discussions is that bodying post-qualitative concepts and questions as particular lived sensations and relations makes clear that how bodies come to matter is both an urgent consideration and a really hopeful gesture towards thinking research beyond humanism. And then my second intention in the book is to never give up on the biosciences, and I'm not even going to pretend that this entire section is not born of my intense, nerdy fandom of biology. I love learning how biology knows the body to work. I love, too, reading feminist science studies scholars' shifts and jolts to the dominant colonial apparatus of science as they draw politics, culture, and method forward as important participants in any scientific process. Accordingly, to feminist science studies is where the book turns, asking how different insights into understanding the biosciences can entangle with post-qualitative propositions, extending our lived vocabulary for tracing how bodying and research intersect. My overarching proposition in this ongoing discussion is that post-qualitative researchers, especially those immersed in studying pedagogy, must create unfamiliar practices for engaging the biosciences. Will these sometimes fail, reiterating the troubling interpretive power dynamics ascribed to colonial sciences? Probably, and maybe you might read moments in the book where I do that. But is imagining how post-qualitative relations with sciences and how they might come together to counter meaningful oppressions, silences, and canyons a project worth pursuing? In the book, I absolutely insist it is. Moving from the big intentions that are grounding the book, I want to talk briefly about the presence of poetry throughout the book. So I think it's funny how you write and think in the company of what you love, and it makes thinking so joyful. I've done that in this book. I've created fractures after each chapter where I pause with different poetry crafted by various poets to reconsider the previous chapter. These are four of my favorite poems. Thinking with their insights and in their glow about how and why we might body post-qualitative researches, I want to suggest to a reader probably the most important move that I make in the book. This is, in a sense, my pedagogical commitment to interdisciplinarity lived loudly. The poems do not bolster my arguments nor make them more palatable to scholars from other disciplines. They certainly do not anticipate or protect against critique. Instead, poetry slows the book down. It's a fracture, a break, because sometimes books, just like bodies, must break. Something happens in a break. I hope that as you read, it is your own aesthetic, rhythmic, and mystic encounters with the poems that you carry with you as you mull over and return to the preceding chapter. My writing in these fractures is my revisiting with the chapter. Yours will be different. The poems ask you to learn to return, to take a fracture and do something in response to its movements. This is, I hope, one of the most active and lived and bodied practices and insights that my little book has to contribute. As I move towards the end of the book, and as the book closes, I turn to thinking most directly with questions of pedagogy. What might bodying post-qualitative research open pedagogical processes towards? And I need to tell you that this is the section of the book that I feel the most nervous and hesitant about. I'm walking a very thin ledge that all too easily tumbles into humanism's instrumentalism and arrogant expertise. But to think pedagogy and to think with pedagogy is too important to ignore, because we do not take on post-qualitative research propositions just for the purpose of research. They're not hollow. I don't want to rethink data, methodology, and clarity in a void, or simply because theoretical resources exist for me to do so. Why be novel just for the sake of being novel? We take on this work, I choose to think, because it has consequences for how we might build an everyday life together. How bodying unfolds in post-qualitative work has gigantic import towards rich relations with knowledge we choose to value, and which we choose to counter, ignore, or refuse. And questions of epistemology are not divorced from questions of education. This leads me really nicely into the provocations that I hope the book shares with readers. And actually, more than only sharing, I really hope these provocations stick to you. I hope you can't shake them off. I hope that every time you notice bodying, these questions scream in your ear and echo around your skull. And I hope that when you forget about bodying, these questions poke you in the eyeball and remind you that seeing's an activity, a snowflake in an avalanche of encounters of meeting a particular world. So here are 3 questions that I hope readers will think with, and that I also hope professors who bring my book to students will steal and offer for discussion. The first provocation is this: how might we build post-qualitative affinities with feminist science studies and the biosciences? What might this make possible in the context of 21st century conditions? Are such affinities necessary in these times? Or do we gain something important from preserving the tenuous, hard-fought space that's post-qualitative work? The second proposition asks, how might attending to Fissures and Fractures mobilize post-qualitative propositions? How do we notice and get to know fissures and fractures in situated contexts? What modes of study do we need? Of critique, of history and inheritance, of invention and speculation, or of reading and writing? What fissures and fractures can post-qualitative research not yet attune to, and why? And perhaps most vitally, how do we get to know the shape-shifting fissures and fractures of post-qualitative research? And then the third and final proposition that I'd like to offer is this: how might we body post-qualitative research? What might such a project ask of us? What practices, relations, imaginaries, vocabularies, flesh, and pedagogies might we need to generate? And with that, thank you very much for listening to the podcast and for picking up the book, and I look forward to seeing what we can create. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you would like to know more about this chapter, please visit the website www.postqualitativeresearch.com, and please stay tuned for future podcasts.